plays great, love it. It's got that great clay sound, you know, that's the sound. That's the sound I fell in love with when I made my first flutes. It's that, I call it the hollow, haunting sound, that you know, the timbre, the color of the resonance of clay, or whatever, the sonic color, if you will. My first master's degree is in anthropology, and I spent a couple of years living in South America studying ancient musical instruments. So among the things that I was interested in was a sort of fairly unknown archaeological phenomenon called the whistling water vessel, which is usually two small vessels that you tip back and forth with water in them. And so I didn't really want to copy the design of that. So I sort of made it my own by blowing up the size and creating it as more of a sculpture with a nod to the only sort of complex or cluster of cultures that made them were in South America, in the world. I mean, at least that we know of from excavations up to now. And they stopped being made as soon as the Spaniards came, for whatever reason. They were either being used or were made for. So I like this idea again of them rocking, and often they become sort of a canvas for the way I'm thinking. I mean, this series had a lot to do with this real aggressive cutting and really spontaneous movement with the clay. So I start with a general idea of a form that I want, but then I begin to, as you say, draw on it, and I want to lift them up. I really press them, and I like the clay to be clay, like to bear the impression of its nature as a soft material, even though it becomes exceedingly hard. And then to tune them, I do all that before they're fired. So I put the whistles in, and what happens is the water will move from chamber to chamber through these lower areas, and as the water leaves one chamber and enters another, the water level raises and it displaces air. So that they begin to push and make a variety of sounds, which I sort of think of as the living sound, because you can't really blow this way, though I have an idea how they'll sound before they're fired. Finally, when the water is pushing there, there's no way that a human blows this way. And I work hard to get this double tone, so the whistle's completely covered at some point, and I slowly cut away material until it actually changes. It'll make kind of a squeaky sound, then when you get just enough clay cut away, it'll suddenly go into the double tone, like that. So you get two tones just from the force that you push the vessel with. And if you go too far, it just loses it. So there's this really small window where you either get it or you don't, or you're putting clay back. So it's a lot of things. And then, of course, the firing process affects the whole thing, too. This is a wood firing, which is about a 4-day affair where you put wood into the kiln relentlessly for about every 5 minutes for all of the hours of the firing. And there's not really any glaze on it. It's whatever the tree gathered during its growing cycle, potassiums and salts, and all the organic material burns away, but it deposits these really beautiful, it's just sort of like snowfalls that they will catch, places. So that's another sort of enhances the form through a real natural process, and it shows the effect of the drawings. So the way I work is, I guess I draw a lot. I draw and I record quite a bit too. So I'm working in a recording studio at my house, and a lot on the wall in my studio. When I'm ready, my studio's like dead clean, and there's paper up everywhere, and I start that way. And I might be going in and out and recording things and thinking about what I need and want, and so I don't know, I start out wandering that way, and then I get sort of honed in on an idea and start, getting aggressive about it. So the winds, and particularly the horns, have to be really carefully calculated in terms of shrinkage. So a lot of my clay body is determined by, the way I developed it, and is is a really predictable shrinkage rate. A small thing will shrink a little bit, and a big thing will shrink a lot. So there's actually a canon of shrinkage involved. But you have to figure out the volume that's inside the tube, and then I had to make sure it fit onto the brass valves, because you can't really make clay valves. And then I fired in around 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, around what potters know is about cone 1 to 3, cone 3. And that leaves a little porosity in the clay, which helps give it this very, very mellow, softer tone, not real harsh, glassy tone, but it leaves it in this realm that I really like. The difficulty of this sort of design, where you're using multiple materials, is how do you attach things together? And here we are in the postmodern era of civilization, as we say, and I take advantage of materials and in some pieces electronics. So in the case of something like this, I'll use a 2-part marine grade adhesive. I use silver solder and brass in some parts. I even use binding. This is what they call barber's linen, but it's linen in wax that can get wet and can shrink in a little bit and make a real strong adhesive. And I've used glues on parts like this, and I don't like, because they don't have any flex. And you end up handling something like this a lot, and it's got to have a little bit of give, which these materials down here do too. So, like I said, I'm not opposed to figuring out a variety of ways of putting things together. But for me, the main sort of important aspect of my work, my exploration is in the resonance of the clay resonators. So though, like, my harp might have some wood and pegs and different strings, essentially the sound is bouncing off of a clay surface, and it's affecting the timbre or the color of the sound through its involvement with clay and its resonance. So it's not so problematic for me to be diverting the air through different sections, as long as the main, the lead pipe is super important in a horn, and then of course the amplification of the bell, and this is all, in tune with how the clay likes to resonate. You see, like on Greek vases, you see triple tubes, but generally into what really looks like a reed instrument. And this is, as opposed to a reed, this is has fipple edges, which function as a blown flute edge. So, but my desire in making it, of course, is to, and I hear funny things like, I'll play it and some people say, well, great, you don't have to hire extra musicians. It's like 3 people, but it's not like that at all. There's a melody tube, which you can, and then there's a harmony tube to that, which you can play alongside. And then I've added a drone, and if you sort of analyze, these are the intervals that I like. I like a minor third, which I can move to a 4th, and to a 5th, and then that will be a 4th below the melody tube. So if I play all 3, so you get a lot of inner, counterpuntal movement, which, it's nice to decide yourself, like how you want that to move. And though I do compose, and I compose partly, on paper and partly through what they call graphic notation. But a lot of what I play is improvised, and like on the spot, you can be moving parts in intertwining ways, and have that, for yourself to play with as you go. So. And then again, this is the terra sigillata surface, and This instrument, of course, is just all play and tuned before the firing, but planning for the shrinkage, so it actually gets a little bit higher in pitch through the firing, predictably, in the best of all worlds. Sometimes I actually fire them a little below where I really want them to be, and I'm not opposed to multiple firings, a little higher each time until I work with my tuner and I get, bam, right exactly to where I want it. I can tune most things in the leather hard state. That's the state where clay is stiff but still flexible enough to cut and add and subtract from. But you can hold it and make things that you can blow into, and they retain the cutting edge that makes sound. And that's my trumpets and saxophones, and with the exception of bells, which you can actually tap and get a general sense of the tone. And the stringed instruments, of course, have to have strings put on, so you don't do that. But most of them I have a pretty good sense of the chamber vibration before it goes into the kiln. Most of us that make our own instruments do so because we hear, or I hear, these sounds in my head that I want to make that aren't really available to me, or at least I don't have the control that I want through buying or finding instruments. So I use a tuning system called, it's not a tempered, it's called just tuning, which is each instrument is tuned to itself, unlike a piano that's actually slightly out of tune from top to bottom, so that all the 12 keys sound okay. But everything is very slightly out of tune on a piano. It's a system called the tempered system that Bach created. And you may have heard of the well-timbered clavichord and all that. So it's so that you can play it in B flat, and it sounds okay with itself, but you can also play in F sharp, and it's not, one doesn't sound grossly out of tune, but that's not my concern. All my instruments may play in 4 or 5 keys, but they play exactly together with all the fifths, mounting up so you feel them in your chest. And people really respond to that, when they hear it. It's just a little more powerful, those intervals that you get. I work in a really subjective way. I work on groups of ideas usually, so I can have some time to get into it. And I need to give myself some time to do that. But I usually get an idea from, I don't know, it's kind of a nexus between music and, I used to always get an idea from sound. Like I wanted a sound, so I'd sort of work towards it. But lately I find myself working towards sort of a structural idea almost, like I really like in my pieces, I like elements of internal and external activity and the relationship between them. I work on ideas like that, or I work on ideas sometimes where I want to move through a space and I want sort of structural elements of it that make sound. And so maybe you as a participant your exploration makes you become like a composer, for instance, just however you happen to choose or what interests you sonically. And in the journey, your body will fall between the peaks and valleys of the wave, and or two waves, and you might feel them compress. So you feel them almost as a landscape as you walk through the room. So I think of sound pretty physically, more and more so. And so I work with objects, but I work with this sort of unseen object, which is a sound wave. So I find myself somewhere wandering in the middle between those two things. And I've spent a lot of my life really interested in the physiology of music. And in fact, the tonal centers that I use are a little slightly off the chart of classical music. Like and I say we as the Western neoclassical world and most genres of Western music adhere to a 440A. That means 440 hertz would be the A that we agree on, and some orchestras have pushed that to 444, and it used to be 380 in the Renaissance and before. But my tonal center is somewhere between G and G sharp, and I feel this place that feels important to me. And I naturally tune my instruments there. And there's a couple of other spots that I just have gravitated to. If the two tones are slightly different, something that would drive, a classical musician, in Western culture slightly mad, if there's a slight difference tone, they shimmer. And these recordings and the people who made the gongs and the gamelons talk about the fact that if you don't have that shimmer, they're not alive. They give life to the instruments that way, and I really adhere to that idea. So if I play, the way I tune this, I've got control. I could make them exactly strobe perfect from chamber to chamber, but I prefer to have them have this slight. So you feel it? It's just kind of a little slightly swimmy, and for me, that guides me into that tonal center. It doesn't distract me. But again, I'm making my own instruments, and who can argue? People seem to enjoy it. So, and I don't take a lot of criticism for because I know I can tune them exactly the same, and it's your choice, and that's why you make an instrument, because you make those sorts of choices, and that's the music that you make is based on those initial choices. So this is an instrument that fits really nicely, of course, in your hand, and that's part of the charm of it is that it's inspired by the idea of what we used to do as children to emulate owls, So I started making these partly because I like that sort of hooting kind of sound, and partly because I began to explore microtonal combinations of sound. So where you can play, for instance, a diatonic or a do re mi scale, or a minor scale. The idea behind this is much more explorative into the notes between notes. So I consider myself the inventor of this. I played with an African wonderful master drummer from Ghana named Obo Adi, whom I met up in Portland, Oregon, and I've been lifelong friends with. And he always called them the pot flute. And so I've just, at some point I started calling them the pot flute too. And I've, people who've taken workshops with me make them, but I've never seen as a design this idea anywhere else, so I'm claiming it. And then another interesting instrument that also uses a real natural approach. This is a harmonic flute. So if you blow really softly, you notice it has no finger holes on it. And the result of a finger hole is essentially to make the flute seem shorter and to act like you're cutting it at different lengths until you recover all of it and blow harder, then you get what they call the first harmonic. But when it gets long enough, and you can sort of cover the end to manipulate it also, you get a naturally occurring series of harmonic intervals that based on the fundamental, which would be the very lowest note the flute can play. You can tell the very lowest note is a very soft note, but the advantage is that you have this whole stack of notes above it. So it's nice, and then of course I make these other harmonic sound generators, and I can weave the harmonics between each other, and I love it. There's something about these naturally occurring harmonic driven waves that, they're in nature, they're everywhere. They come out of your washing machine when it's on its cycle. They're in the trees, leaves when the wind blows. And if you get in tune to them, I feel like it's like the day that you look at the sky and you realize it's not blue. It's like it starts as orange and it goes into green and yellow hues, and you're like, oh, the sky's got lots of colors. And I was calling it blue for so long, but it's hardly blue at all. And I feel that way when you start to hear harmonics. They crack open like rainbow spectrums or prisms or something, and so I make different lengths and sizes of harmonic fluids, and I make these harmonic resonators, and I'm going to try to weave these sort of natural occurring sounds together in the tonal centers that I love so much. There's a real thing about the tonal centers, a really important sort of healing aspect to it that I know people respond to, and I've worked in some healing settings, and it's pretty exciting. I mean, it's really, really amazing, and it's something that I feel like a little like the old Stradivarius violin makers. They didn't have the engineering, and they didn't have the mapping and computer analysis and x-rays that we have, but they crawled towards what they knew was a beautiful tone, and that's my approach. I crawl, really, literally. I mean, if you use pure physics, you can change one thing at a time, and I don't work that way. I change 4 or 5 things at a time. But as I do that intuitively, I'm moving towards what I know is richer and deeper, sound and relationships that I find really interesting. So that's kind of drives my musical process that way.